What if the world had never seen the Russian Revolution? The vast expanse of history and the elaborate interconnected series of global events make it nearly unthinkable to conceive a world where this colossal incident didn't transpire. Can you envision the 20th century without the infamous hammer and sickle emblem that came to represent the Soviet Union? What would the shift look like if the rise of communism, a political ideology that substantially molded the global landscape, never happened? During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Russian Empire extended from Eastern Europe to the northern reaches of Asia, making it one of the most sizable empires in all of history. This empire was marked by an autocratic czar, a figure of immense power and authority over the vast lands and the diverse populace residing within them. The Tsar held the ultimate authority, influencing everything from economic matters to religious practices. His reign was signified by a distinct lack of political freedom. The prevalent social structure of the empire was primarily agrarian, with a significant portion of the population consisting of peasants. These peasants, forming the crux of the Russian society, lived under oppressive conditions with scarce rights and liberties. The working class was also subjected to a life filled with struggles. With extended working hours, meager wages, and subpar living conditions, their life was anything but comfortable. Such distressing conditions were the product of the Tsar's policies, which were devised to sustain control and quash opposition. The Tsar's autocratic rule sowed the seeds of widespread social dissatisfaction. This discontent percolated among the peasants and the working class, incrementally intensifying over the years. The seeds of a revolution were planted, watered by the appalling living conditions, paltry wages, and political oppression. Let's delve deeper into this. The peasants lived in a state of perennial poverty, working on lands they didn't own, and handing over a large part of their produce as tax. Their homes were often overcrowded and unsanitary, with entire families cramped into single-room huts. The workers didn't fare much better. They toiled in dangerous factories for up to 15 hours a day, with minimal breaks and hazardous working conditions. Their wages were barely enough to afford basic necessities. These were the brutal realities of life under the Tsar's rule, realities that ignited the people's discontent and yearning for change. In 1905, a revolution surfaced, a revolution that proved unsuccessful but nonetheless significant. The Revolution of 1905 was an essential landmark in Russian history, a forerunner to the more radical changes lying ahead. However, it wasn't the revolution that the people had aspired for. Though the Tsar's government succeeded in quelling it, the revolution left a lasting impact on the Russian populace, stirring their longing for a more substantial upheaval. The Revolution of 1905 was a sign of a more profound shift. It was a precursor to the Russian Revolution, a revolution that wouldn't solely transform Russia but would influence the entire world. The Russian Revolution set into motion the rise of communism, a political ideology that has steered the trajectory of world history. Could you picture a 20th century devoid of this tumult, without the hammer and sickle emblem of the Soviet Union, without the ascent of communism? Can you comprehend how different our world would be? The unsuccessful revolution of 1905 was a harbinger of the more radical changes that lay in wait. By the time 1914 rolled around, the planet was in the throes of war. This wasn't just a minor squabble, it was a momentous shift in world politics and human history. Most notably, the continent of Europe was thrust into a brutal conflict that would lead to the loss of countless lives and redraw the global political map. This was not a war confined to one continent, but a worldwide conflagration, with nations around the globe aligning themselves with one side or another in a lethal global showdown. At the center of this catastrophic event was Russia, far from being a mere observer. The expansive country, stretching from the eastern edges of Europe to the remote corners of northern Asia, was an integral member of the Allied powers. This coalition, that included significant players like France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Japan, and the United States, was bound by a common objective, that of thwarting the Central Powers. These Central Powers, a formidable coalition of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, presented some serious opposition. Their military capabilities and strategic expertise made them a formidable force. For Russia, the confrontation with the Central Powers was a grueling ordeal. one that was not only fought on the battlefield, but also within its own borders. These times of war laid bare the frailties of Tsar Nicholas II's administration. His reign was marked by ineffective leadership and lack of strategic foresight, which became glaringly evident as Russia grappled with the tribulations of war. The Russian army, once considered an unbeatable force, was facing severe losses and morale was plummeting, but the woes were not limited to military defeats. There were economic repercussions to the war as well. Russia's economy was floundering, with skyrocketing inflation and food shortages becoming the grim reality for many of its citizens. This economic instability further fueled the growing dissatisfaction among the Russian populace. The war also acted as a trigger for political transformation. As Tsar's failures became more and more apparent, dissident voices grew louder. The Russian people, once submissive, were growing increasingly restless. Protests and strikes were becoming commonplace, and revolutionary ideas were gaining traction. The seeds of revolt were being planted, laying the groundwork for a revolution that would forever alter the Russian landscape. Indeed, the world was at war, and for Russia this war served as a mirror, reflecting its own internal strife and dissatisfaction. As it battled against the Central Powers, it also wrestled with its own escalating internal problems, leading to a political upheaval that would send shockwaves around the globe. Transitioning to February 1917, the vast nation of Russia found itself entrapped in the crippling clutches of an intense crisis. The circumstances were dire. The once majestic nation was precariously balancing on the brink of utter devastation. The root of this disastrous situation was the war, an uncontrollable beast that had ruthlessly sucked the vitality out of the nation's economy, leaving behind a hollow shell pervaded by disparity and despair. This monstrous war had an insatiable hunger, devouring the nation's limited resources and shoving it into the deep pit of financial ruin. The Russian citizenry, once known for their stout-hearted resilience, now found themselves wrestling with an unimaginable level of suffering. The war had not only wrecked the country's financial stability, but it had also ripped apart the fabric of its social structure, leaving the masses beleaguered and devoid of hope. The once lively days filled with the sounds of industry and commerce were now replaced with the ghostly silence of deserted streets and closed-up windows. Families were gathered together for warmth, their faces carrying the harsh reality of their circumstances etched on them. In these turbulent times, Petrograd, Russia's portal to Europe, accelerated into becoming the nucleus of civil unrest. The city, renowned for its dynamic culture and revolutionary spirit, was suddenly transformed into the platform for widespread protests and strikes, a mirror reflecting the pent-up anger and frustration of its citizens. The air hung heavy with tension, and the city's typical buzz was replaced with the thunderous uproar of disagreement. Nicholas II, the Tsar, who was once an absolute authority, suddenly found his reign under an overwhelming assault. His rule, already tainted by military defeats and political missteps, was now crumbling under the massive pressure of popular dissatisfaction. The public outcry against his leadership reverberated through the halls of the Winter Palace, serving as a harsh reminder of his rapidly diminishing influence. Confronted with the unalterable wave of revolution, he was cornered. The Tsar had no option but to abdicate, his once firm hold over Russia gradually slipping through his fingers. In the resulting power void, a provisional government was established. This shift in power signified a significant moment in Russia's history, altering the nation's course for good. This newly formed government, rising from the remains of the old regime, was burdened with the monumental task of navigating Russia through the tumultuous sea of revolution and into an unpredictable future. Nonetheless, the provisional government too fell short in resolving the issues that were plaguing Russia. This temporary ruling body, established in the wake of Tsar Nicholas II's renunciation, was anticipated to be a lighthouse for a nation under duress, but the reality was quite different. The government, in spite of the early optimism, exhibited a noticeable lack of competence in addressing the nation's multifaceted socio-economic challenges. Despite having an abundance of resources at their disposal, the provisional government's utter mismanagement and failure to cater to the people's needs became all too clear. An escalating economic crisis, rampant inflation, and widespread shortages of food and fuel all further magnified the dissatisfaction and unrest among the Russian populace. This escalating disillusionment among the masses provided a window for revolutionary factions to rise and challenge the incumbent political establishment. Amid this unstable situation, the Bolshevik Party, under the unyielding leadership of Vladimir Lenin, rose as a beacon of hope for the citizens. Lenin, a man of steadfast beliefs and unwavering determination, pledged to the people what they yearned for the most: bread, land, and peace. His mantra struck a chord with the impoverished and war-exhausted Russian people who were yearning for a switch. Propelled by these guarantees and the party's persistent propaganda, the Bolsheviks garnered widespread popularity. By 1917, the situation had reached a boiling point, and the Bolsheviks seized this opportunity to take power. They initiated an armed uprising, now referred to as the October Revolution, leading to the downfall of the provisional government. This pivotal moment in Russia's history marked a stark transition from a botched democratic attempt to a socialist rule. Lenin, along with his party, triumphantly took the reins, immediately taking steps to secure their newfound power and introduce drastic alterations in the socio-political landscape of the nation. The Russian Revolution led to the effective termination of the Tsarist autocracy, thus paving the path for the erection of the Soviet Union. The once formidable Russian Empire, governed by an autocratic Tsar, was substituted by a socialist state, thereby heralding a new era in the annals of world history. But imagine an alternative timeline, a world where the tide of history took a different turn, where the Tsarist regime continued to rule unhindered by the force of a revolution. What would that world look like? The Russia we would know could be significantly different, molded not by the clenched fist of a communist regime, but the sceptered hand of monarchy. Had the Tsarist regime persevered, Russia might have gradually evolved into a constitutional monarchy akin to Britain. The impervious Tsarist autocracy could have been softened by the societal call for change, leading to a steady transformation to a system where a symbolic monarchy exists, but the real power lies within a democratically elected parliament. This arrangement could have led to a significant increase in the public's political power, thereby reshaping Russia's social and political terrain. The Tsar would still serve as a ceremonial figurehead, but the true control of the country's government would be vested in a democratically elected alternate path, characterized by a mix of tradition and modernity. Could have been an intriguing blend. The Tsar, symbolizing Russia's rich past, and the parliament chosen by the masses, embodying a pledge towards democratic principles and advancement. In this scenario, without the influence of the Soviet Union, the proliferation of communism in the 20th century would likely have been greatly diminished. The rise of the Soviet Union was instrumental in disseminating communist ideologies globally. Without its presence, these ideologies may not have gathered significant momentum. The absence of a communist powerhouse could have considerably changed the direction of global politics. The Cold War, a geopolitical conflict marked by an ideological tug-of-war between capitalism and communism, might have played out differently. The balance of power could have shifted, possibly causing the Cold War to be less intense or maybe not transpire at all. In this divergent reality, the dynamics of the Cold War would be completely altered. The ideological battlefield would lack one of its chief combatants, leading to a potential shift in the balance of power. This could have had far-reaching implications on global politics, dramatically changing the dynamics and outcomes of the Cold. However, the lack of the Russian Revolution would not automatically equate to a tranquil planet. The Russian Revolution, a major juncture in global history that happened in the early 20th century, drastically reshaped the socio-political landscape. It signaled the end of eras of Tsarist rule and initiated the creation of the Soviet Union. This seismic shift didn't just reverberate within the bounds of Russia, its echoes were felt across continents, resounding through the halls of international diplomacy and the global stage. The Tsarist regime, the governing power, was inherently problematic. The Tsars had governed Russia with an unyielding grip for countless years. Their rule was typified by autocracy, with power concentrated in the hands of the sovereign. The Tsars lived in grandeur and luxury, while a large portion of the populace suffered in poverty. This glaring socio-economic inequality was a significant driver of dissatisfaction among the masses. The socio-economic status in Russia during this era was grim. Most of the populace consisted of peasants living in poverty and enduring brutal working environments. The Industrial Revolution had spurred urban growth, with peasants flocking to cities in hope for better circumstances. However, cities were saturated and the factory work conditions were inhuman. The absence of social progression, along with the exploitation of the proletariat, cultivated a hotbed for dissent. This dissent could have unfolded in numerous ways, triggering various types of unrest. These disruptions could have materialized as worker strikes, peasant revolts, or even a civil war. The Russian Revolution was not the sole possible outcome. It was merely the one that came to pass. Without the Soviet Union, other world powers, such as Germany or the United States, could stepped in to fill the void. The global power equilibrium during this time was dicey. Major world powers were entangled in a competition for dominance, each attempting to extend its influence. The non-existence of the Soviet Union might have generated a power vacuum that other nations could have seized, radically shifting the power dynamic in unforeseeable ways. This could have led to a distinctive type of global power balance. Imagine other nations filling the gap left by the Soviet Union. This potential power balance could have given rise to an entirely novel world order, wildly different from what we are familiar with today. For instance, without the Russian Revolution, Germany might have become the dominant power in Europe, potentially leading to a different outcome in the world wars. The United States could have exerted more influence in global politics, accelerating the spread of capitalism. Other nations like China or Japan might have emerged as significant powers, altering the geopolitical landscape of Asia. Without the ideological struggle between communism and capitalism, the Cold War could have been avoided, leading to a completely different set of international alliances and conflicts. However, even in this hypothetical scenario, the absence of the Russian Revolution wouldn't necessarily mean a peaceful world. To truly comprehend the magnitude of the Russian Revolution, one must take into account its profound impact on the world's historical trajectory. It was truly a watershed moment. The revolution's backdrop was an era of extraordinary social unrest, economic instability, and political chaos, an era where the Russian people were grappling with a harsh existence. The flames of the World War, coupled with a scarcity of essentials like food, sparked a strong dissatisfaction among the public. The revolution was not merely a political upheaval, but it was a palpable shift in ideology. Propelled by a deep-seated desire for change, the Russian people yearned for a society that was more equitable, where power was not a privilege of the few but a right of the many. This marked the advent of communism, an economic and political system that pledged to offer equality and justice to all citizens. It held out the promise of a future where oppression by the ruling class would be a thing of the past. Out of the revolution came the establishment of the Soviet Union, a first-of-its-kind communist state rising from the ruins of the Russian Empire. It set the groundwork for other nations to follow suit. The influence of the Soviet Union was not confined within its borders, but spread to other parts of the globe, marking the birth of global communism. This revolution and the consequent establishment of the Soviet Union ushered in a new era in global politics. The world was bifurcated into two contrasting sections: the capitalist Western nations under the leadership of the United States and the communist Eastern Bloc under the helm of the Soviet Union. This divided global politics for much of the 20th century and gave rise to a series of politico-economic and military clashes, collectively known as the Cold War. However, it is fascinating to conjecture what the world might have looked like had the Russian Revolution never transpired. Could there have been a different balance of power? Perhaps different conflicts could have arisen? The 20th century as we know it might have taken a radically different turn. However, it's important to underscore that the socio-economic conditions in Russia at the time rendered some form of upheaval unavoidable. The revolution was a response to the prevailing circumstances, a product of its time. Despite how captivating it might be to dabble in alternate historical speculations, the fact remains that the revolution wasn't an aberration but an inevitability given the circumstances. To sum up, the Russian Revolution was a pivotal event that dramatically altered the course of world history. It catalyzed the spread of founded the Soviet Union and reshaped the global political landscape. Yet it also compels us to contemplate on potential alternative world histories and a different version of the 20th century. Thank you for embarking on this enlightening expedition through a turning point in history and its possible alternatives with us. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like and subscribe and stay connected for more explorations into thought-provoking historical content.